My name is Amy. I graduated from the Falls Church Fellows Program in 2008, which was about 7 years ago now. When I entered the program, I think unlike some of my fellows, I knew that I wanted to be a high school English teacher. I had studied English education in college, and I had really loved teaching at a local high school in Cincinnati for my student teaching. That said, at the end of college, I still had questions about whether my desire to teach in a public school would somehow limit my ability to share the gospel. And so when I found out about the Fellows Program, it seemed like a really great fit to explore some of those questions. So I guess if I'm also honest, I had spent the first 18 years of my life in Ohio, and while I love Ohio, part of me was really excited about getting to move east and explore Virginia. So during my years of a fellow, in January, I was hired by a local high school, and I've been teaching at that high school for the last 6 years. At my high school, this year I'm teaching 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. So on an average day, I interact with about 20 different colleagues, both in my own department and across the school, and about 100 different students that are quirky and funny and make me laugh. So on an average day, I expect to experience laughter and frustration and surprise and then eventual exhaustion, all by 2:45 in the afternoon. So outside of school, I guess I'm a little bit boring in my hobbies. I continue on. I do love to read. I like to write on my own, and then I love to take walks with my husband at night when he gets home from work. We got married in August of 2012. We met at church during my fellows year. And I like to say that he was so envious of my experience as a fellow that he felt like the next best thing was marrying in. So tonight, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about how conversations about narrative and story during my fellows year impact my work as a teacher today. So I've loved stories since I was little. I grew up reading the Berenstain Bears, the Babysitters Club, Nancy Drew. I remember getting scolded for bringing books to the dinner table. And in high school, my love of literature continued. I was captured by classics like To Kill a Mockingbird, The Sound and the Fury, Crime and Punishment. So by my senior year, I knew I wanted to be a literature teacher, and I went on to college and loved my literature courses and thought about how to take literature and translate it to the high school classroom. So I've always known that stories were powerful, but it wasn't until my fellows year that I really considered that this deep love of story is actually an arrow to the God of the Bible. So I look back and treasure the conversations that I got to have about story during my fellows year, because we serve a God of stories. So I love stories and you love stories because God loves stories. And we are transformed by stories, and we get our identity from stories, which is why we are up here tonight sharing stories. So I'm going to quote Walker Percy as well. During my seminary class, Steve Garber presented us with this quote. So this was probably in February of my fellows year, and I felt like everything clicked for me. And the quote was, "Bad books always lie. They lie most about the human condition." Let me say that one more time. Bad books always lie. They lie most about the human condition. So I was sitting in class thinking, yes, so if bad books lie, then good books tell the truth. And this quote now hangs in my classroom, so I get to look at it every day and remember what my job as a teacher is. So as an English teacher, one of my callings, amongst others, is to use literature that is good and that is truthful to help my students discover more of their humanity. So for the last 6 years, I've taught The Great Gatsby. And this is a book I love, and I feel like it was popularized last year by the movie. So I'm hopeful that if I talk a little bit about this story, you all will have context for it. I've read the story many times, so the prose is familiar, yet each time I read it, I feel like the story remains just as poignant. My husband does not like this story, and he will always say to me, "Amy, there isn't one likable character in the entire book." And I agree. Most of the characters in Gatsby are selfish and foolish and unlikable, really. But I think that the book tells the truth about what it means to be human, and for that reason, I love teaching it to high schoolers. So when I first started teaching the novel, my high schoolers are fascinated by the the cars, and the clothing, and the alcohol, the women, and the parties. They envy the wealth that is possessed by all of the characters in the story, and they long for that wealth in their own lives. We have discussions about whether money is connected to happiness, and my students will argue quite passionately that it definitely is. Even this week, I was walking through and my kids were doing small group discussions. We're sort of at the beginning of Gatsby, and I heard a student say, "I'm so jealous of Gatsby." I guess for all of humanity, wealth is extremely intoxicating to my students. And yet, as we move through the novel together, the students begin to see the limits of a life that is based solely on material gain. So they see that the pleasures of the daily pleasures of things like women, alcohol, and women and alcohol can be satisfying in the moment, but pursuing pleasure as the end game on earth leaves each character in Gatsby at the end of the novel feeling disconnected from its community, isolated and hardened. So my students, by the end of Gatsby, are confronted with the logical end of a life that is lived only after material pleasure. At the end of the novel, I asked my students to write me a letter about what the novel has to say to them about living life in 2014. There are always a few students that will continue to lust after the glitz and the glam and the money of Gatsby, and that's real life. I teach at a school of imperfect human beings. But there are some that every year consider alternatives to this life option that is presented by Fitzgerald. They will consider alternatives like pursuing the steadiness of family, the gifts of friendship, or even a firm foundation of faith in a higher power, and sometimes even the God that I know. So when I read these letters, I am brought joy. I get to watch my students who live in a pretty hedonistic culture that isn't that much different than the one Jay Gatsby lives in, wrestle with truth. And some of them have scales fall from their eyes, and they begin to ask really good questions about their identity. Important questions for a 17-year-old to ask. Questions like, who am I? What is my purpose? What do I believe will provide me satisfaction here on earth? What do I believe about the importance of money? How can alcohol be destructive when used inappropriately? What does it mean to love? I get the privilege as a teacher of walking my kids into this experience through Gatsby. It was the Fellows Program that helped me to have this wider vision. And so throughout the school year, whether it's teaching Gatsby or Frankenstein or The Adventures of Huck Finn or another good book that tells the truth about humanity, like Walker Percy says, I realize that honest stories are powerful and instructive, and I get to bring those stories to my students. And the Walker Percy quote is a reminder of just that. So thank you for listening, and